Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Wargame Red Dragon. This is the fourth part in my Wargame Red Dragon series, and in this video I'm going to be taking a little bit more of a look at history based on the First Korean War. The reason I'm doing that, in the previous videos I've talked about tanks and the gameplay that I was playing through at the time, and a few other things that weren't really related to the historical Korean War, and with good reason. You know, this game isn't based exactly on history. It's a fictional game, fictional conflict based on, a what if of a second Korean War. But the reason I decided I wanted to take a look at the historical war for this video is because in this scenario, in the Pusan Perimeter campaign, which takes place in Wargame Red Dragon, the goal is basically to recreate history. You can see here on the lower right hand corner of Korea what we actually have is we have a new Pusan Perimeter in which the South Korean army is surrounded with the sea to their backs, and basically the North Koreans are threatening to throw them into the sea. Now what you end up having is further up on the top left portion of the screen right now near the Incheon province, you're going to have an American task force come into the map, and you're going to be landing troops in the province of Incheon with the goal of advancing across the Korean peninsula, pardon me for that, with the goal of cutting off the North Korean forces to the south. Now the reason I want to talk about history is that's exactly what happened in the actual Korean War. So this hypothetical scenario for a second Korean War is basically a recreation of the historical war which took place in 1950. And for that reason, I wanted to talk about that. What's the significance of Incheon? What is the significance of the landings which took place there in 1950, and how did it influence the conflict, and how might it influence a modern-day conflict? It seems unlikely that the North Koreans would simply ignore the lessons of Incheon if they did find themselves in a similar position. But before we get to that point, before we get to the point where we can say, what happened at Incheon and how was that significant, what we need to understand is how did we get to a place where the South Koreans were pinned with their backs against the sea and on the verge of defeat, and it took a very bold maneuver by the United Nations forces, primarily led by the United States under General Douglas MacArthur, to launch a very risky amphibious assault, which was the last of the great amphibious assaults under enemy fire, to basically turn the tide of the war. And while it did not end up winning the war, it certainly ended up saving South Korea. So how did we get to that point? How did we get to the point where a desperate assault against a beachhead in the enemy's rear was the primary way to turn the tide of the war? And was it really? Incheon is billed as this great turning point in the Korean War, and maybe it wasn't really the case. Maybe the Korean War maybe the tide had already turned prior to Incheon, and Incheon was just a dramatic way to speed up that reversal. But that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, and that's what I want to go ahead and talk about here today. Now, I am going to preface this with, this is a new microphone that I'm using today. I'm using a Rode Procaster. It's the first time that I've been able to use a dynamic microphone, a dynamic studio quality microphone. So if there's some awkwardness in some of the video, I apologize for that. I've used it in one video before. That's my ultimate general video in which I used it for the first time, but I'm still kind of getting used to this. And as sensitive as this is, it might pick me up breathing and I might not notice it when I edit it. So if there is anything like that, please throw that in the comments, let me know. I'm definitely always trying to improve. What we see on the screen right here is actually the Inchon Landings. So I will say that my historical discussion that I want to talk about in this video is a little bit ahead of, a little bit behind where we are in terms of the game. The Inchon Landings are happening, but I didn't want to discuss it, while we're playing through the Inchon Landings. And this is one of those new features that's included in Wargame Red Dragon, is the ability to have amphibious assaults, the ability to have naval units. And you'll get to see a little bit of that here as I play through this and as I discuss this. But I didn't want to jump ahead and just talk about Incheon without talking about everything that came before it. Because in reality, the Incheon invasion, or the Incheon landings, the Battle of Incheon, was significant only because of the context in which it occurred, and only because of the battles that predated it. So, it's one of those things where The video is a little bit ahead of the topic I wanted to discuss, but I still think it's important to kind of understand why what we're watching here on the screen of a modern-day reenactment of an Incheon invasion would, it's important to have context. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and let's take a stroll back to the 1950s. The World War II had ended 5 years prior. There were a lot of unresolved territorial disputes, one of them being in Korea. Now, the situation in Korea was complex, and part of that has to do with the way that World War II ended in the Pacific. If you're not familiar with the island of Korea, it's located just west of Japan, so it's in eastern or Southeast Asia, I guess. Well, it's probably more Vietnam, but it's in East Asia, so it's on the Korean peninsula, which is attached to mainland China. It also borders the Russian, I guess at that time it would have been the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation, as we know it today, has the port of Vladivostok very close by, and it's just to the west of Japan. It's a peninsula, again, that comes off of China's mainland, and the end to World War II is very significant to the Korean peninsula, and let's go over why. So in the Pacific theater, the majority of the fighting throughout the war, kind of the opposite of Europe, was actually conducted by the United States, to a lesser extent Britain, and toward the very end the Soviet Union jumped in. After Nazi Germany had been defeated in Europe, the Soviets transferred a large portion of their military to the east and ended up launching an offensive against the Japanese forces. By this time, Japan was reeling and had very little fuel, very little ammunition, very little food left for their soldiers to fight. The Japanese army quickly collapsed, and the Soviet army actually raced into parts of seized China and ended up racing into the northern portions of Korea. So when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, there is some argument that definitely probably has some merit, that part of the bombing was in an effort to stop Soviet advances by ending the war sooner rather than later. The Americans had already been experiencing a period in Europe where it was increasingly looking like, or at least the fear was, I guess it hadn't gotten to the point yet where they would have really known for sure, but the fear was that the Soviets would not leave the territories that they ended up taking. And it ended up being the case. The Soviets would set up basically a empire in Eastern Europe of puppet states loyal to the Soviet Union, which would lead to a long-term Cold War. The United States obviously couldn't know all of this yet by this point in time, but they were very leery of the Soviets gaining more and more ground. So when the bombs were dropped and the surrender was signed, the Soviets were actually already advancing into parts of Korea. Part of the surrender said that Soviet forces would advance as far south on the Korean peninsula as the 38th parallel. I believe that's a longitude or latitude. I'm terrible with latitude and longitude, but basically the horizontal axis at the 38th parallel is where the Soviets were told to stop. Interestingly enough, the Soviets stopped there right along with the treaty. They followed the letter of the law, despite the fact that it took American forces about 3 weeks to get to the 38th parallel. The Soviets didn't take advantage of that. They were good to the word of the treaty, and they ended up stopping there. So at the 38th parallel, the two sides met, and what ended up happening was the United States ended up setting up a pro-Western dictator. Well, they didn't intend for it to be a dictatorship necessarily, but South Korea ended up being ruled by a pro-Western dictatorship, hardly a democracy, while the North ended up being ruled by a communist party. And Korea was split essentially into two nations under the block of the Cold War. There were numerous attempts and numerous periods in time where both elements of North and South Korea were supposed to hold a vote on reunification, but for one reason or another it never occurred. The North was worried, and the Russians and Chinese later, once they defeated the Nationalist Party in China and became Communist China, and I think it was 1948, both the Soviet Union and China were concerned of Korea turning pro-West and a pro-Western party set up in place. And, the Americans, in their case as well, they were worried that the nation would vote to become communist. Especially, I would imagine, and granted, I'm not a scholar on the matter, but I could only imagine, having a dictatorship being a little bit worried, well, maybe the people aren't going to vote to be a member of this dictatorship. Maybe they'd rather, a communist rule. But either way, for one reason or another, the vote never took place. This is, interestingly enough, similar to what happened in Vietnam, not so much in the way the country was, split in two, but sort of that same fear, and what caused a lot of the fighting was the unwillingness of really everyone involved, be it the North Korean leadership, the American leadership, the Soviet leadership, and the South Korean leadership, really, to hold a referendum to decide the fate of the country. Well, what ended up happening as both of these countries basically refused to reunite and refused to hold elections, and nothing came of it, the North began to militarize itself and began to basically threaten to reunify the country by force. And the South, took it somewhat seriously, but perhaps not seriously enough. The United States definitely didn't take it seriously enough. The Soviets supplied over 500 T-34 main battle tanks to the North Korean forces, and several hundred aircraft as well. And on June 25th of 1950, after World War II had been over by just under 5 years, a new massive ground war erupted as more than 200,000 North Korean soldiers stormed across the 38th parallel into the south. And this is where the story of Incheon really begins, is on this attack. Allied forces were caught almost totally by surprise, Allied forces being at the time the United States, which did have some forces in country, and the South Koreans as well were completely overwhelmed. They had many American pieces of equipment, and there were American troops in place. The United States, under President Truman, decided to act. This was in the height of the anti-appeasement era. There was a lot of lessons still being mulled over from World War II, and the idea of the appeasements which occurred between the Western powers and Hitler, basically allowing Hitler to gobble up Austria and Czechoslovakia in two separate pieces before anyone did anything about it. There was a fear that communism could spread like a domino effect. If you allowed one country to fall, then numerous countries could fall. And a lot of these reasons came to coalesce into Western countries coming together in opposition of this conflict and coming together in a military force. The United Nations, which had just been formed several years prior, actually held a vote on what to do with the conflict in Korea. There were fresh lessons. Basically, the United Nations was basically the younger brother to the League of Nations, which had so remarkably failed in its attempts to stop the wars in Europe and Asia after World War I. And then leading into World War II, the League of Nations essentially proved inept and incapable of bringing nations together to oppose aggression. Well, interestingly enough, this was one of the early crises that the United Nations had to deal with, and it dealt with it remarkably successfully, largely because, for various reasons, the Soviet Union, which was one of the Security Council members, was not attending the votes. They were protesting certain actions of the United Nations, and as a result, they were not taking part in any votes. This was clearly a foolish move on their part, especially if they knew that one of their allies was going to be launching a war, as it allowed the United Nations to pass a resolution which called for the United Nations forces to fight a war under a common United Nations banner against the aggression of North Korea against South Korea. Again, this would have been impossible if the Soviet Union had merely attended the meeting and vetoed the vote. Because of the 5 countries that are chosen to sit on the United Nations Security Council, each one of them gets veto power, but the Soviet Union did not participate. So that was interesting, to say the least. So the North Korean forces rolled over, however, and despite the fact that the United Nations was coming to the aid of the South, the events occurring in theater were simply occurring too quickly. The invasion started on June 25th of 1950. After just a couple of weeks, the South Korean forces were being completely overwhelmed and driven back. The forces stood very little chance. They didn't have heavy enough weapons to stand against the Soviet T-34 tanks, which I believe were the T-34-85 variant, which would have had an 85mm cannon on it. and they had limited armored units. There were several American units in theater as well, and most of those suffered terribly as well, lacking heavy weapons and the ability to effectively resist against the North Korean assault. They were heavily outnumbered and heavily outmaneuvered. It's important to note that throughout the entire advance, early in this period of time, the South Korean and the United States forces struggled to ever form a cohesive line, a cohesive defensive line. So often U.S. forces would fight fiercely and defend and sometimes defeat attacks to their front, but the enemy would flank around them and force them to withdraw or risk being encircled. And this was a trend which would occur throughout the early stages of the conflict, where U.S. forces would hold firm, and even Korean forces would sometimes hold firm against North Korean attacks, only to be overwhelmed and surrounded or driven back. Often the North Koreans would find U.S. forces and attempt to go around them. They would end up attacking South Korean forces, which were not as well trained, led, or equipped, and would end up basically defeating the South Korean forces, and then U.S. forces who had fought well and had been able to defend themselves had to end up retreating anyway or risk destruction. This occurred for several weeks with basically almost identical results time and time again. It wasn't until mid-July that the situation changed or began to change, where forces began forming stronger defensive lines and putting up stronger resistance against the North. The most famous example of this ended up being at a battle which I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce the name, but I'll give it a shot anyway. The Battle of Daejeon, or Daejeon, it's Taejon. The battle took place between July 14th and July 21st. Now, the South Korean capital is dangerously close to the 38th parallel. If you're keeping up on current events, you may know that already, as it's been mentioned several times that in recent days that the North Koreans have the ability to basically wipe Seoul, the South Korean capital, from the face of the earth without even crossing into South Korea. And this is true. So by this period of time, by July 14th, the war had been going on for just under 3 weeks. South Korea's capital, Seoul, had already fallen. The forces were being driven back, as I've already stated, and Daejeon is a city kind of in the central part of South Korea, kind of central northern half, but I guess I'd say central, kind of in the middle of Korea. And Allied forces were being pushed back, allies being the United Nations and South Korea, were being consistently pushed back and driven back. It was here that the United States decided that it needed to put up a rearguard action to buy its other troops time to continue their withdrawal, to attempt to delay the North Korean advance in a way that would allow forces further south better chances to defend themselves. And this is really where the story of Incheon begins. Because here, this was a famous engagement which lasted from July 14th until July 21st, in which U.S. forces were continually attacked and put up heavy resistance fighting a delayed action. The main forces involved were the United States 24th Infantry Division, which consisted of the 34th, 21st, and 19th Infantry Regiments, and some miscellaneous South Korean forces, no large bodies of troops, but definitely some miscellaneous South Korean troops were involved. It was a defeat for the United States tactically. The North Koreans overwhelmed and eventually forced the U.S. forces to withdraw, but it took a full week. The North Koreans had been advancing relatively quickly with very little serious resistance in terms of delays up through the 14th of July, and from the 14th until the 21st, they ended up becoming bogged down around the city of Daejeon. This defense ended up earning a U.S. Army General, William F. Dean, a Medal of Honor, in which he actually personally took out a North Korean tank. How many times can you see a major general taking out a North Korean tank? Might be one of the few times after World War II, well, even in World War II, it's one of the rare times, I would say, in the modern era where you would see a major general actually using his weapon in combat and actually fighting alongside of his soldiers and not some command hut in the rear. And that's not to criticize generals on the whole. It's just the nature of warfare has changed. You don't have generals in saddles anymore like you did in the Civil War within musket range of the enemy. With communications and the scale of battle being so much larger, warfare has certainly changed. But it was the case at the Battle of Daejeon that William F. Dean took out an enemy tank well, not all by himself, but basically by himself, and ended up becoming a prisoner of war. He was going back, supposedly he was going back for water for a wounded soldier during the pullout of Daejeon, when the U.S. forces had recognized that they basically had to leave or they would be cut off and destroyed. So he was basically amongst the last of the U.S. forces leaving. He was staying back with some wounded, and he was trying to tend to a wounded man, getting him some water. He had been knocked out and ended up basically wandering through the countryside before being taken prisoner, and would end up becoming a prisoner for the rest of the war. But as it was, his actions at this battle and his 24th Infantry Division's actions at this battle ended up buying the U.S. and Korean forces and other UN forces to the south a substantial amount of time to rest, reorganize, and begin forming the Pusan Perimeter in the southeast corner of Korea. The U.S. forces were being driven back steadily. They knew that their best chance for a defensive perimeter to be formed would be around the Pusan Perimeter, and this delaying action helped buy time for those defenses to be prepared. The U.S. in the battle lost about 922 killed, another 2,400 missing or captured. That's about 3,400 out of an 11,400 man division. So you've got about a quarter of the unit lost as casualties. North Korean casualties were unknown. July 21st is when the battle ended. North Korean advances resumed their rapid pace following that battle and ended up driving UN forces all the way back to the Pusan Perimeter by early August of 1950. So basically, between June 25th and August 4th, you ended up having a UN force driven all the way back from the 38th parallel at the border of Korea over 100 miles into the southeastern corner of South Korea and on the verge of defeat. Again, the story of Incheon was already being written throughout all of these actions, and it was August 4th, technically, that the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter began, a mere, 37 days after the war had begun. It was essentially a last stand. It was a battle in which UN forces essentially circled the wagons. It was the first time in the Korean conflict, which had been taking place for some 37 days, that Allied forces were able to form themselves into a continuous line all the way from the coast on one end, across the Pusan Perimeter, to the coast on the other end. The coast on the eastern coast of South Korea, and then the southern coast of South Korea, a sort of box-like shape with the sea to their back and huge amounts of enemy troops to their front. Initially, the Allied forces were heavily outnumbered, but Pusan was a great place to form a final defensive stand, as it was a very solid port, probably the best, if not, maybe not the best, but one of the best ports in all of Korea. It's still an important commercial port today, and was a perfect place to form a defensive line, as there was a solid mountain range and very rugged terrain, which made it very difficult for the North to assault. It also had several rivers, which made assault even more difficult, and by this point the North Korean troops were at the end of a very long supply line, which had become very, very vulnerable to Allied air attacks, which were raiding them incessantly. Air attacks from the Americans, who had carriers now offshore, who had aircraft on the Korean peninsula, and who also had aircraft coming in from Japan, were incessant and caused North Korean troops to require most of their movements to occur at night in order to avoid huge-style air attacks. The war to this point had been fought mainly with World War II tactics, and World War II carpet bombing would begin as the war would go on. American B-29 bombers, which were made so famous during the Pacific campaigns of World War II, were brought out of mothballs and put into the service. Strategic Air Command bombers were sent to the Korean peninsula and loaded up with conventional bombs, and there was even some talk at some points during the initial phases of the war of using nuclear weapons to stop the North. Fortunately for everyone, that did not occur. Carpet bombing actually became so prevalent that you would see the largest close air support or direct infantry attack carpet bombing assault that was made against enemy troop concentrations. It was the largest raid since the Normandy invasion, I believe the Cobra assaults, the Operation Cobra, when the United States brought in B-17s to pound German forces to attempt to break out of Normandy. Well, Korea was the largest bombing operation against a concentration of enemy troops since then, and it had about the same success rate. It actually ended up bringing in, let me take a look at that. It took place on August 14th near the city of Daegu. There was a 27 square mile rectangular area in which the Allied intelligence had estimated the enemy had more than 4 divisions or more than 40,000 men in the area, planning to stage their assault on Daegu, which was a key linchpin in the defense at the Pusan Perimeter. The Allies called in all of their heavy bombers, all of their air force, basically to flatten this area where they were convinced a large number of enemy troops were. The American air commander didn't think his aircraft could successfully carpet bomb an area any larger than 3 square miles. So, from 3 square miles to 27, you got a pretty big gap there between what the commander thinks he could do and what they actually did. The bombers came in at 10,000 feet and dropped over 900 tons of bombs on the area. It required the entire bombing component of all the forces in the Korean theater, and by the end of it, they had dropped more than 3,084,000 pounds of explosives on their targets, just in 500-pound bombs. They also dropped over 150,000-pound bombs, and it was the largest Air Force operation, again, since the Battle of Normandy. Now, what was interesting is, after the bombing had occurred, it turned out the North Koreans didn't have troops in that sector. It's actually, there was no ability by the Allies to prove that the bombing was successful in killing a single North Korean soldier. It kind of reminds me of what would happen very often later in South Vietnam, where large raids of B-52s, not to the scale obviously, but B-52s carry way more bomb loads than B-29s, where large bomb-laden B-52s would come in and flatten entire segments of jungle on the understanding that there were North Korean or Viet Cong forces in the area, and often it either wasn't the case or it wasn't verifiable. That huge tons and quantities of weapons were being wasted on areas where there was no real conclusive evidence of enemy troops being there. Now, there was at least the added benefit that the bombing did seem to reduce enemy artillery fire, so it's possible they could have had artillery batteries in the area or maybe ammunition supplies in the area, but they're pretty certain that there were not large bodies of troops. So basically at this point, the Allies are completely cut off in the Pusan perimeter with only the sea to their back. Large numbers of reinforcements are coming into the area, and the Allied carpet bombing is being unsuccessful, causing the Allies to rethink their strategy and decide that fewer and fewer large carpet bombing raids should be used against direct enemy troop installments, more against strategic targets like railroads and supply depots in the rears, and more fighter bombers being used in close air support roles, something that really foreshadowed what developed into the Vietnam War and kind of the way that air power is used today, a further evolution of what happened in World War II. And then, again, the forces are kind of cut off at this point, and with only a thin supply line coming through the sea, and MacArthur begins to decide we need to land troops further north. That's what we need to do next. We need to land troops in the enemy's rear, we need to cut them off, and that'll free up our troops here in the south to begin a counteroffensive. And that's really where the Incheon offensive was born. Now, there was a lot more that was still going to occur before that offensive occurred, and I'll talk about that in my next video. But that basically lays the groundwork for the Inchon Landings, which I've already done here in this video. And I'll talk about it more in depth here in the next video. And I appreciate you tuning in, and I appreciate you watching. I hope you did enjoy it, and this history lesson episode, if we'll call it, will continue shortly. So until next time, this is the Historical Gamer for the Wargamer.com saying thank you for tuning in, and again, until next time, thank you for watching.